Fast forwarding 7 books ahead, we see him beginning book 8 with the words, friendship is a virtue or involves virtue, and also it is one of the most indispensable requirements of life. For no one would choose to live life without friends, but possessing all other good things. He starts right off with a rather bold claim, and he's giving people a lot of credit here. He's saying no one would choose to live a life without friends, even if you offered him $1 trillion. No one would take you up on that, if it was with the condition that you must never have a friend. And he's right. I mean, actually he's wrong. Unfortunately, there are some people who are so very short-sighted that they would take up that offer. But it wouldn't be a good idea to do so, because without any real friend, without a single friend, nothing would really be worth having, because you wouldn't have anyone to enjoy it with. And it would soon, the very things that you thought were worth having will suddenly turn into actual pains for you, because you'll realize that you have no one to enjoy them with. No one would choose to live a life without friends, but possessing all other good things. Indeed, a bold claim, but spot on. And that answers why it's such a serious philosopher as Aristotle writing a treatise on friendship. That would be quite awkward in some philosophical circles today to start philosophizing about friendship. The one criteria in some philosophical circles today is that you mustn't be philosophical. You have to just dwell on all this superficial garbage and analytic philosophy and consider questions that no one cares about and that don't affect anything. Well, that's certainly not Aristotle's approach to philosophy. Philosophy, quite simply, as its very job, philosophy's job, I'll put that in capital letters, is to reason about life's most important questions as carefully as possible. And friendship, indeed, is an indispensable requirement of life. One of the most, he says, even. He doesn't just say it's a hand. I'll quote him directly here. Friendship is one of the most indispensable requirements of life. It is not happiness itself, but it is an integral dimension thereof. It is sometimes a means, but not really. Aristotle specifically says here that it is not only indispensable as a means. Yes, we need friends for practical reasons, but that's not primarily why we need friends. It is noble in itself, he says. It is not a mere means to something else. Friendship is not something you want just so you can get something else out of it. It's something you want for its own sake, an integral dimension of your eudaimonia. And that is a further explication of what he said in the beginning here, that no one would choose to live a life without friends even if given all other goods. Anything that is a mere means is useless if you already have all goods, because mere means are, think back to our discussion in the Republic and technology and means and ends. All things that are mere means are only worth discarding if you already have the ends towards which they are directed. You don't bother with medical technology if you already have health. You don't want military technology if you already have peace. You don't want transportation technology if you're already where you want to be, so on and so forth. So if friendship were one of those things that were a mere means, we wouldn't want to bother with it if we already had all of the good things. But of course, we do want to bother with it because it is not a mere means. It's something we need for its own sake as well. He also relates this to politics. He says this is a necessary political consideration as well. It is the bond of the state. He says, moreover, friendship appears to be the bond of the state, and lawgivers seem to set more in store by it than they do by justice. A good lawgiver would much rather inspire good citizens, not by making them afraid of punishment, but rather by inspiring a certain approach in them to their nation, their city-state, what have you. This is called solidarity. It's not a word that Aristotle uses, but it's a great word to describe what he's getting at here. Well, how is friendship the bond of the state? Well, justice alone is not enough. Solidarity is needed. Solidarity being the social application of friendship. Is needed as the bedrock of society. He goes further than saying justice alone is not enough. He says, if men are friends, there is no need of justice between them, whereas merely being just is not enough. What does he mean by saying there is no need of justice between them? How dare he reject justice? Well, he's not rejecting justice. He's saying justice is necessary, and of course, it must be never violated, but there are ways of moving beyond something without violating it, and that's certainly the case with justice. Justice is, for example, keeping a strict account of transactions to ensure that neither side is gypped. That's what you do when you're shopping. That's what you do when you're paying your taxes. You want to make sure that you are not paying a penny more than you have to, and those you are paying are trying to make sure that you're not paying a penny less than you're obliged to. That's justice. Nothing wrong with that. Do you do that with friends? Do you have a shared Google spreadsheet where you keep track of every single time each of you gave the other a ride, how much the gas cost, each time you bought your friend a beer, and each time your friend bought you a beer, to make sure that there's this perfect balance? No, that would be ridiculous. If you do that with a friend, you should really reevaluate that friendship, as we'll see in accordance with the criteria Aristotle is about to give us. Why? Because justice is not even needed among friends. More on that later in the treatise. Anyway, the point here is lawgivers themselves are trying to inspire not identical, but a similar approach to society itself. And that only can a society like that really be a fruitful one, a flourishing one, a good one. Needless to say, we are very far from that today. But the last time, I wasn't alive for this, but the last time that I know of where this was really at least attempted strongly was by a president some decades ago who famously said, what I'm sure you've all heard before, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And that is a poetic way of saying, don't always ask for justice. Try to go above and beyond. Just like you would for a friend, try to take that approach to society itself. A nation of citizens who can approach their nation that way is a good nation. I don't know how we could ever get back to that, but we need to try. Because that's the only thing that can be the bedrock of a good society, solidarity. Anyway, he points out that there are 3 fundamental types of friendships, which you all know. I'm sure you all remember that well from the reading. Those based on goodness, those based on pleasure, and those based on utility. There are, of course, as many types of friendships as there are friendships. Every generalization is a simplification, we know that. But this is still very helpful, these 3 categories of friendships. Why? So that we can try to make sure that we have friendships based on the good. Based on goodness, pleasure, and utility. These are the three motives of love, he says. The term friendship, love in the more low sense of the word, is desire in general, things that you want. He says there must be an exchange, which is why the term friendship is not applied to inanimate objects. You may wish the good of your iPhone, in other words, but your iPhone does not wish the good of you as much as it might seem it does. So, unfortunately, you cannot be friends with your iPhone. You can only be friends with something that also wishes you good in return. This doesn't seem like it needs to be said, but it does. What characterizes the first two forms of friendship? Well, the first two, by first I mean lowest two, I really should have clarified that. That based on pleasure and that based on utility. I'm going to get back to this as we go through the treatise a number of times, but he says these friendships are based on accident, since the friend is not loved for being what he is, but as affording some benefit or pleasure as the case may be. So he says that we're talking now about pleasure and utility. Friendships based on pleasure and utility are based on accident. We haven't had an Aristotelian metaphysics discussion yet, so I need to quickly say accident in philosophy does not mean by mistake. It means rather not essential. There are certain things that are essential to human nature that humans all share of, the intellect, things like that. Hair being brown or blonde is not essential to human nature, but accidental. In this case, I clarify that in every time we talk about that now, because last time I didn't, some years ago, I had a student's paper. Her whole paper was refuting Aristotle, saying that these friendships based on accident aren't real friendships because she, by accident, bumped into somebody at a store and became really good friends, and she went on and on about this, and she kind of missed the point. But it was my fault because I didn't clarify this enough. So I still gave her a good grade, but because she was sincere. But yes, you can have a good friendship by mistake by bumping into someone. But what he means is if your friendship with someone is based on pleasure or utility, it is not actually based on the person. It is based on something that you are getting out of that person. Therefore, it is based on something accidental, not essential to the person. Therefore, it is not even a friendship in the same sense of the word. He's going to get to this eventually, but I don't know exactly when, so I'm going to mention it now. These are merely analogous to true friendship. And once you realize that something is merely analogous, it really makes sense to put it in quotes every time you use it. You don't have to, but you could. Like from this point forward, I could, and probably should, although I don't think I will. Maybe I will, I don't know. Put the word friendship in quotes when I'm referring to a friendship of pleasure or utility, because it's not a real friendship. There are three ways of using the same word: equivocal, analogical, and univocal. If you use the same word univocally in two different cases, you mean the exact same thing when you're referring to one thing or another. Gold is metal and copper is metal. You mean that word metal univocally. There are also equivocal uses of terms, and this is often how fallacies arise, not always, but as one source of fallacy, equivocation. When you're using the same word, but you actually mean something completely different by it in different cases. An extreme example would be a dog barks and there's bark on a tree. Same word, no relation in their meaning whatsoever. But then there's something in between equivocal and univocal, and that's analogical. We call a food healthy, and we can call a person healthy. Do we mean the exact same thing? No. We mean something greater. It's related in a way, but we mean something greater when we refer to a person as healthy, as when we refer to a food as healthy. And Aristotle is saying here it is analogous. It's that type of a use of the term friendship. When we refer to a genuine friendship, that is one based on goodness, versus when we refer to a friendship based on pleasure or utility. It's a mere analogical use of the term. It's merely analogous, in other words. It's not even really a friendship at all. But we will call it that from now on, but still understanding that we mean it analogically. Hence, when the motive of friendship is past in these cases, when the pleasure is gone or the utility is gone, what happens to the quote friendship? It's also gone. And there's sometimes nothing wrong with that. Aristotle's teachings here remind us to not lie to ourselves and pretend that a situation we're in simply because we enjoy it or simply because we're benefiting from it is an actual friendship when it's not. Maybe you got along well enough with your boss at some job, but you're moving somewhere, and your last day at work you say, "Oh yeah, let's be sure to keep in touch." What happens after that? You never ever again talk to that person. And there's nothing wrong with that, because you both knew that was just a nice little formality and that you'd never talk to each other again. Why? Because your quote friendship wasn't really a genuine friendship. It was an arrangement based on utility. You were benefiting from each other, and there's nothing wrong with that as long as no one's being manipulated in the process and no one's lying to the other. The problems arise when we pretend that friendships based on pleasure and utility are real friendships, or worse still, when we manipulate others. And when does this happen? When does this manipulation especially happen? All over the place. It's like when one person leads another on into thinking it's a real friendship, but they're really only in it because they're getting something out of it, whether it's something useful to them or some sort of a pleasure. This is, of course, often the case in romantic relationships that are not good ones. One person is finding pleasure from the situation, and that's about it. And it's a big lie that swallows up a whole life in the process sometimes. Utilities is prone to manipulation as well. Maybe not as bad as the former case, but we often see that, think about someone who's really good in math, and suddenly when calculus starts, he's got all these new friends. No, he doesn't. He's got a bunch of people who want his help on the math homework. He doesn't, and maybe some of them are lying and pretending that they really want to be good friends with him when they're not at all. So, it is about, Aristotle is giving us the proper principles necessary to be honest with ourselves and with others. He has a few words for the young here, and I'm going to read them even though they're a bit harsh. But the key to remember here is that it doesn't have to be this way. He's describing how things tend to be. And it's a cautionary tale. He says, "The young guide their lives by emotion, and for the most part pursue what is pleasant to themselves, and the object of the moment, and the things that please them change as their age alters. Hence they both form friendships and drop them quickly, since their affections alter with what gives them pleasure, and the tastes of youth change quickly. And also the young are prone to fall in love, as love is chiefly guided by emotion and grounded on pleasure, and hence they form attachments quickly and give them up quickly, often changing before the day is out." I think he's describing modern middle schoolers on Twitter or Instagram or whatever they're on these days. So it's nothing new under the sun, of course. That's certainly not a good way to live, so with such fickleness. He says, "The perfect form of friendship, on the other hand, is between the good and those who resemble each other in virtue." I'll give you a couple more things to put down for what characterizes friendships of utility and pleasure when we get to it. But now that we've stumbled upon his introduction to the perfect form of friendship based on goodness, let's have some things down for that. The greatest form of friendship, obviously, is based on goodness. And it can only occur between those who resemble each other in virtue. Doesn't mean they have all the exact same degrees of all the virtues, but generally speaking, they share the virtuous life. In virtue, the beautiful thing about that, there are many beautiful things about virtue, but it's universal. It's not about cheering for the same sports team, as innocent as that may be. It's not about having the same superficial, vain interests that change with one year to another. It is about sharing the life of virtue, encouraging, loving that good life in the other, making it happen more readily, helping the other to grow in that very goodness, loving that goodness. They desire, and one of the big things here, let me jot that down. They contribute to and increase their goodness mutually. The ultimate symbiotic relationship, if you will. The good of the other is willed for the other's own sake. That's just as important to have down. They will. The definition of love is to will the good, to want, to genuinely desire and seek what is good for the other. They will the good of the other. To get something out of them? No. For the other's own sake. Finally, they desire each other's company. Aristotle says nothing is more characteristic of friends than they desire the society of one another. Just because it's a friendship based on goodness doesn't mean it's also not enjoyed. It is enjoyed, very much so. In fact, it's enjoyed even more so than a friendship based on pleasure. Because the friends are enjoying each other for who they are, not for some external, secondary thing that they get out of the other. So if you find yourself with a certain friend never wanting to actually see him or her, but saying, let's not get together, let's just Snapchat or something. And if that becomes a repeated habit year after, month after month, you should probably start asking yourself whether it's a genuine friendship, whether it's something worth the effort of maintaining, or whether maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's just a question worth asking. Genuine friends want to be with each other. Aristotle also says, however, that the wish to be friends is a quick growth, but friendship is not. So you can meet someone and really hit it off with them and think, this is great, we're really on the same page of things and enjoying this conversation. That's good. That's a good thing. But don't confuse that with friendship. The wish to be friends can be a quick growth. Friendship itself is something that needs to be worked on over time and built up. However, the friendship based in utility dissolves as soon as its profit ceases. For the friends did not love each other, but what they got out of each other. Friendships based on pleasure and utility can exist between two bad men. So the mere fact that one is in a supposed friendship doesn't prove anything about the person, because it might very well be a friendship, a so-called friendship of pleasure or utility. There are plenty of bad people who think they have a lot of friends, but all it takes is one genuine friend to prove, well, that you're not actually a bad person. Why? Well, Aristotle says, but clearly only good men can be friends for what they are in themselves, since bad men do not take pleasure in each other, save as they get some advantage from each other. So, genuine friendship is something that can only exist between the good. So, Aristotle's building up this argument where we need friends. And we don't just need quote friends, we need real friends. And what are real friends? Real friends are friendships based on goodness. And that involves a number of things. But above all, it involves friends who are themselves good. Therefore, the only way of having this thing that you need friendships, you need real friendships, you need friendships based on goodness. But the only possible way to have one of those friendships is what? To choose to live the good life yourself. Now, you might say, well, that's a catch-22, because don't I need good friendships to become good? Well, yes, it's involved, but they can't do all the work for you. You got to at least start trying to live the good life on your own, and yes, having good friendships will help you grow in that. What is the difference between liking and friendship? Let's see here. Here it is. Liking, Aristotle says, is an emotion. Friendship is a fixed disposition. Another very important teaching. How fitting that our social media day and age is obsessed with this idea of liking things. And it's encouraging us to not live a careful, rational life, but to live it based on the fleeting emotions of the moment. Liking is an emotion. Friendship is a fixed disposition. It is not something that you are in simply when you are in the mood to be in it. It is a quality that you hold on to. If it is a fixed disposition, it's something you carefully choose. You don't flippantly enter into it, and you certainly don't flippantly break it. It's a real bond. Of course, there are many degrees of friendships. The greatest would be marriage itself, which is more than just a bond. But all friendships are a bond in some sense. They are not about merely liking something or someone. Moving more on that, Aristotle says, man is by nature a pairing creature, even more than he is a political creature, inasmuch as the family is an earlier and more fundamental institution in the state. We just talked several minutes ago about how important Aristotle's teaching is on man as a social being. But Aristotle's saying man is even more so a being ordered towards pairing, in other words, marriage, even more than he is just social in general. It says the combination of the sexes aims not only at continuing the species, like in other animals. Whole human beings cohabit not only for that sake, but also to provide for the needs of life, as men and women have different functions, and they supply each other's wants, he says. He moves on, complaints and recriminations occur solely or chiefly in friendships of utility, but not in friendships based on goodness. Why? Because they vie with one another in giving and not getting the benefit. So this is another thing we can jot down for what characterizes the first two forms of friendship. Let's have down for pleasure, we have a couple of things. Utility, we have a couple of things. But the key here with utility is prone to complaints and recriminations, meaning accusations. I'll just put down prone to complaints. If you are constantly complaining about the other not doing his fair share, and if the other is constantly complaining about you not doing your fair share, probably isn't a friendship based in goodness to begin with. Why? Because in a genuine friendship based on goodness, the friends want to give more than they get. So it doesn't even make sense to complain if they think that's the case, because that's precisely what they want. Now, you have to be careful that you're not being used, obviously. But if it is a genuine friendship based on goodness, and the friends in the friendship are themselves good and want what is good for the other, there's not this constant worry that you're getting the short end of the stick, because you'd rather get the short end of the stick so that your friend can have the bigger end of the stick. He says, a friendship whose motive of utility is liable to give rise to complaints. For here, friends associate with each other for profit, and so each always wants more, and he thinks he is getting less than his due, and they make it a grievance that they do not get as much as they want and deserve. And the one who is doing a service can never supply all that the one receiving it wants. And this is obviously the case in, quote, friendships, and I don't mean that at all in any similar sense of the word, but arrangements where we all know full well that it's purely for the sake of utility. You know, you're very likely to complain about a product, perhaps, if it's not what it was advertised to be, and rightfully so, because no one's pretending that was a friendship. But if a supposed friendship is constantly giving rise to these complaints, then one should wonder what the motive of that friendship really is. This begs the question, though, what about friendships based on the good and receiving from that friend? Isn't that okay to receive benefits even from a friendship based on the good? And the answer is yes. Aristotle says, one ought therefore, if one can, to return the equivalent of services received, and to do so willingly. For one ought not make a man one's friend if one is unwilling to return his favors. So Aristotle is saying, yes, even friendship is based on the goodness. Their motive is not utility, but there still will be an exchange of favors. So you don't have to feel bad about that. You don't have to feel shoot, this is a friendship based on utility just because you're exchanging favors. Friendship is based on the good, do that as well. Of course, there are plenty of, quote, friendships that just start calling things, arrangements, favors, when in fact it's something much darker. Think of the mob, they're always talking about favors there. That's certainly not what Aristotle is referring to. Genuine exchange of favors is a good thing. The last thing that I want to get to from Book 8, and we'll take a break after this and then finish Book 9 after the break, is what is the fundamental consideration in all moral philosophy? What can it do and not do? He alludes briefly to this in the very last paragraph here. In friendships based on virtue, complaints do not arise, but the measure of the benefit seems to be the intention of the giver. For intention is the predominant factor in virtue and in character. Okay, so there's a one-word answer to this, intention, but there's much more we have to put down. But before I put that other stuff down, I'm going to draw you guys another picture. You're really going to wonder this time why I'm not an art professor. All right, here is my wife. That's my wife. When my son was 3, he drew that picture for her. She's holding a sword, in case you're wondering what that is. That's a sword. So I think that's a fairly accurate portrayal of what my son, when he was 3, handed to her. He was watching lots of Chronicles of Narnia or something and really liked swords at that point, so it was only natural for him to draw a picture of his mother holding a sword. So when he handed her this picture, did my wife say, Joseph, that's hideous. That has no artistic value whatsoever. That's just garbage. No, she didn't say that. She did not say that at all. She received it with much affection and gratitude. Why? Because she saw what? The intention behind it. The objective value of that picture is rather low. It is a rather lowly work of art, objectively speaking, on the outside. But, as Aristotle says, the predominant factor in virtue and in character is intention. What someone genuinely, sincerely intends to do is the thing that determines its moral worth. But we have to be so careful philosophically with what intention can do and what it cannot do. So what can it do? Like right here, intention can make a small act great. But it can also do some unfortunate things if the intention is not good. What else can it do? Intention can make an act that otherwise would be good. What? Yeah. Intention can make a good act bad. Like, any examples? Ulterior motives in general, Think about some politician who goes and volunteers at a soup kitchen. That's a good act. It's an objectively good thing to do. But he makes sure that there's lots of cameras there, and the very second the cameras leave, so does he. What was the intention? Publicity, nothing else, photo op. So that just devalued the act itself morally completely. Maybe it wasn't bad, but it was at least worthless. There are other things where even something good can become blatantly bad depending upon the intention. So we all know that a bad intention can ruin an objectively good thing. We all know that if something good is done for us, and we realize it was done merely to get something out of us, we say that we feel used, and that's never a good thing. But here's what intention can't do. And what I'm going to write down here, I think I've alluded to this in previous classes. This is one way of phrasing the fundamental premise of all good moral philosophy. Unsurprisingly, therefore, it is the very opposite of what some modern moral philosophies teach. Intention cannot make a what act what? A bad act good. Evil may never be done that good may come from. If something is wrong in and of itself, there's no use pretending that any supposed good intention can render it a good act. You can't directly and intentionally murder an innocent human being and pretend that you have a good reason for doing so. In other words, no matter how good your intention was with that, it's hard to imagine a good intention for that, but there are plenty. Every horrendous thing done in history was done with the best of intentions. It's not like Hitler himself wrote his Mein Kampf saying, you know what, I just hate I hate life, I hate people, I hate society, I want to destroy it. It's not what he said. I must admit I've read some parts because I want to see what such a twisted mind generates, but he talked what? Anyone read Mein Kampf, the whole thing, more than I have? He talks about he's going to save society and make the world such a better place. And all he has to do is murder a few million innocent people to do it. And he doesn't say that in his manifesto, of course, but that was his plan. We all know that a bad act is a bad act, and a supposed good intention doesn't change its nature into good. Unfortunately, there's a popular thing called utilitarianism, which claims precisely that as long as you can do a calculation and suppose that more pleasure will result from an act than pain overall, then go for it, it's good. If society ever gets so twisted that it just loves the idea of sitting there in an arena and watching people get tortured to death, then do it. It's just a few people being tortured to death, and millions of people are deriving great pleasure and enjoyment from that, so do it. Great intention. But of course that's horrible. We all know that's horrible. Those are extreme examples, but I give them because that is the valid reductio ad absurdum of a utilitarian situation ethicist type approach. Situation ethics saying there isn't any such thing as a good or a bad act, there's only situations and circumstances that determine by themselves, independent from the nature of the act, what ought to be done. Which is really another way of saying there is no such thing as an ought at all. Anyway, there are such a thing as bad acts. They cannot be made good by supposedly good intentions. That is our last point for Book 8. So let's take a break. So we're now at Book 9 of Nicomachean Ethics, and it naturally goes with Book 8, which is why I had it be part of the same reading. Aristotle here talks more about the idea of being a friend with oneself. First he says that the good man is of one mind with himself and desires the same things with every part of his nature. Also he wishes his own good, real as well as apparent, and seeks it by action. For it is the mark of the good man to exert himself actively for the good. And he does so for his own sake, for he does it on account of the intellectual part of himself, and this appears to be man's real self. And then he also desires this same good for the sake of his friend. He says next something interesting. No one would choose to possess every good in the world on the condition of becoming somebody else. I think he's right. Because we often foolishly ponder, what would I do if only I were that person? I wish I was that person. When you say, I wish I was that person, what are you actually saying? You wish that you yourself what? Didn't exist. Because you are you, and if you were someone else, you wouldn't be you, and if you weren't you, then who would be you? Nobody. Therefore, to wish that you were somebody else would be to wish yourself out of existence. But as Aristotle himself says, existence is our first and greatest good. Just wish yourself out of existence would be the very worst possible thing you could wish. Anyway, when people say that, they don't really mean it. They mean, I wish I had that person's job, or that person's possessions, or that person's looks, or something like that. But we should be careful with how we speak, and we should ideally never say something like that. I wish I were that person. It's very important that you yourself exist. There's a reason that you yourself exist. But he continues, but only while remaining himself, whatever he may be. And it would appear that the thinking part is the real self, or more so than anything else. And the good man desires his own company, for he enjoys being by himself, since he has agreeable memories of the past and good hopes for the future, which are pleasant also, and his mind is stored with subjects for contemplation, and he is keenly conscious of his own joys and sorrows, for the same things give him pleasure and pain at all times, and not different things at different times, since he is not apt to change his mind. Aristotle is not advocating for closed-mindedness as a demeanor. He's just advocating for stability of mind. There's a great quote from Chesterton, who I've quoted a couple of times in previous classes. He said, the purpose of the mind, of opening the mind, is the same as the purpose of opening the mouth. To close it over something solid. He's relating that to eating. Now, closed-mindedness as a demeanor, of course, is not a good thing. But when one has arrived at an individual truth, not a general ideology or a general approach or a general demeanor, but an individual truth that you've already intellectually, in your own conscience, verified with certainty the truth of, that is worth closing your mind over. To dogmatically oppose dogma is just as dogmatic as any dogma itself. In other words, radical skepticism is self-refuting. So, for example, you've all closed your mind, I'm sure, around the fact that 2 + 2 is 4. That is very worth closing your mind over. But mind closure is not restricted to mathematics. There are plenty of other propositions that are worth closing your mind over. And again, that doesn't mean become closed-minded. It means have stability in those things you've already verified the truth of. For example, I hope you've all closed maybe it's hard, maybe you can close your mind against some things as a starting point at least. Sometimes that's easier than closing your mind over some things. I hope you've all closed your mind against racism. That's obviously, absolutely, completely wrong. That is very worth closing your mind against. But guess what? Racism isn't the only evil thing. There's lots of other evils that are worth closing your mind against, and there's lots of goods that are worth closing your mind around. We must do so not in sweeping terms haphazardly. That's what makes you closed-minded, but carefully, particularly. Once and no one can tell you what to close your mind. Only you know, because only you know if you're certain of something. So, but once you yourself have definitively verified the truth of something, yeah, it's worth chomping down on if it's solid. And that's what Aristotle's advocating for here. It's part of becoming a good person, is becoming stable in those things that we know are true, so that we're not just a reed swaying in the breeze for the rest of our life. It's very interesting that he says that the same things give him pleasure and pain at all times. The good person, the good man, is not this. He's not torn apart by contrary desires, in other words. Aristotle's description of the good man as a friend of himself is very alluring in a good way. And it's accurate, I think. But let's see his description of the one who is not a friend of himself. And then after I read this, I'll give you a couple things for your notes for that question. This is a bit lengthier, but it's worth reading. The bad, on the other hand, are at variance with themselves. desiring one thing and wishing another. And this is the mark of the unrestrained, who choose what is pleasant but harmful, instead of what they themselves even think to be good. Others, out of cowardice and idleness, neglect to do what they think best for their own interests. And men who have committed a number of crimes and are hated for their wickedness actually flee from life and make away with themselves. And bad men constantly seek the society of others and shun their own company, because when they are by themselves, they recall much that was unpleasant in the past and anticipate the same in the future. Whereas with other people, they can forget. I have to pause at that because that is powerful and how accurate that is. We just spent the whole book 8 talking about how the good enjoy their friendships even more than the bad enjoy their, quote, friendships of pleasure and utility. Sure, they're engaged in them for reasons of pleasure and utility, but they don't even enjoy them as truly and sincerely as a good man enjoys a good friend. Despite that, despite the fact that the bad do not even enjoy their so-called friendships very much, they're still constantly trying to be around other people. Because even though they don't enjoy the other people that much, they're kind of always annoyed and irritated by them. Even though they don't enjoy them that much, what they hate even more is being alone. Because when they're alone, the one they are least good friends with, namely themselves, they can't get away from. So when they're alone, they're always thinking dark thoughts. What they've done in the past that was bad comes back to haunt them. They anticipate more of the same in the future, the anxiety. That's exactly what Aristotle says here. Now, what in his day could only really be done by physically being around others can today be done so much more conveniently. How? Exactly. Good prop. Social media, television, internet, all these things, even radio. I'm not a Rage Against Millennials guy. This goes back decades and decades. This constant need to have some sort of media going all the time to make us feel like we're with somebody. Because if there's ever silence, that's when the thoughts really start coming back. And it's what thoughts come in the silence that kind of indicate the nature of one's character. Silence is one of the most important things, and it's the single thing that we're missing most severely today, silence. You can't find it anywhere anymore. I like to walk in graveyards all the time because it's one of the few places that you can find silence anymore. The people who like blaring their music and their phones everywhere tend to not go there. So it's one of my favorite things to do is walk in graveyards. The silence is just wonderful. But if we never have silence, if we can never confront our own thoughts, we'll never even know who we are. Well, if we're just zoning out in front of some media all day, every day. But that's exactly what the bad need to do. They need to distract themselves from themselves, Aristotle is saying. Moreover, they feel no affection for themselves because they have no lovable qualities. Hence, such men do not enter into their own joys and sorrows, as there is a civil war in their souls. One part of their nature, owing to depravity, is pained by abstinence from certain indulgences, while another part is pleased by it. One part pulls them one way, and another the other, as if dragging them asunder. Or if it be impossible to feel pleasure and pain at the same time, at all events, after indulging in pleasure, they regret it a little later, and wish they never acquired a taste for such indulgences, since the bad are always changing their minds. Hearkening back to Gorgias here, if you can remember that long ago, remember Socrates argued, no, you are in pleasure and pain at the same time. Like when you're eating, you're in pleasure and pain at the same time. Aristotle's not contradicting that. He's just saying, even if Socrates is wrong about that, even if you could not be in pleasure and pain at the same time overall, but there's always one state kind of dominating in general, even if the bad man can be in a genuine state of pleasure from time to time, for periods of time, it's completely outweighed by what he feels immediately after that pleasure that he's indulged in ends, namely the remorse and the regret and the depression, the anxiety, and everything else that comes right after it, the guilt. That always completely outdoes any transitory pleasure that he had derived from the indulgence before the guilt. Thus, the bad man appears to be devoid even of affection for himself. If then such a state of mind is utterly miserable, we should do our utmost to shun wickedness and try to be virtuous. That is the best way, both to be friends with ourselves and to win the friendship of others. So Aristotle's not sitting down here and writing you some self-help book on how to win friends and influence people. He's saying if you want to have good friendships, be a good person, and then you will have good friendships. If you want to be utterly miserable, be a bad person. All right, that's a lot of stuff. I'm going to give you more briefly for your notes. The good man, let me make this quick. I'm going to really sum up a lot of things he said in one brief sentence here. The good man has nothing to disturb his peace. Everything that disturbs peace comes in some way, shape, or form, if you follow it back far enough, to something that is not good in your demeanor and your behavior. Think about Socrates himself. He was in prison about to die, and even his peace could not be disturbed, because the genuinely good man has nothing to disturb his peace. The bad man hates his own company. Because he then cannot distract himself from himself. He hates silence and he'll destroy it at all costs. He can't sit there and enjoy a sunset because he's just thinking about how terrible of a person he is. All right. Let's move on to Concord. He has a brief aside about this idea of Concord. Concord seems also to be a friendly feeling. It is not merely agreement of opinion. This might even exist among strangers. To agree about the facts of astronomy is not a bond of friendship. Concord is said to prevail in a state when the citizens agree as to their interests, adopt the same policy, and carry their common resolves into execution. Concord appears, therefore, to mean friendship between citizens. Concord in this sense exists between good men, since these are of one mind, both with themselves and with one another, as they always stand more or less on the same ground. For good men's wishes are steadfast, and they do not ebb and flow like the tide, and they wish for just and expedient ends, which they strive to attain in common. Remember, Aristotle chooses each word carefully. He does not lengthen descriptions just to make his papers longer. When he says just and expedient, he says those both because they're necessary. Ruthless businessmen might get together in a boardroom and agree on expedient ends. Expedient meaning strategic. But they won't agree on just and expedient. The good man, yes, he wants what is expedient. He wants to be practical, he wants to be shrewd, he wants to be strategic, but he always, above all, wants to be just. And multiple good people will want both what is just and what is expedient. And only in that case is genuine concord possible. The base, meaning the bad, on the other hand, are incapable of concord, except in some small degree, as they are of friendship, since they try to get more than their share of advantages, and take less than their share of labors. And while each desires this for himself, he spies on his neighbor to prevent him from doing likewise. For unless they keep watch over one another, the common interests go to ruin. The result is discord. Everybody trying to make others do their duty, but refusing to do it themselves. Concord versus discord. Okay, let's have a couple principles down for this. Concord requires shared principles and shared action. It is associated with friendship. And it's kind of like, you could even say, it is a team mentality. To use an overused proverb that coaches love, there's no I in team. Nothing wrong with that saying. It's a good one. And what that old saying is trying to encourage is an approach of concord here to the team. Share the principle, share the action, try to take on more than your share of the labors, and don't go demanding that others do what you yourself are actually not even willing to do. And this is, of course, the opposite of discord, which Aristotle describes incredibly accurately in the same paragraph. Discord is, of course, what we mostly see today, especially in politics. There is almost no concord, not even on the same side of the aisle. There's only discord, it seems. I love some works of fiction that have portrayed so well the difference between concord and discord. One of my favorite work of fiction is probably The Lord of the Rings. And you think about the bad guys. They hate the good guys, yes. But almost as much as they hate the good guys, they hate what? Each other. If anyone's ever seen or read, any of those three, the orcs are always very well portrayed as just constantly at each other's throats, literally. They're always killing each other also. They hate, of course, the Fellowship of the Ring, the good guys, but they hate each other almost as much. And you see this is not mere fiction. Tolkien was an expert psychologist and philosopher, even though neither of those things were his job. He realized that this is exactly what groups that are not directed towards the good inevitably become. They become full of discord. And that could be because the individual members are not good, and it could also be because the existence of the group itself is not in accordance with the good. It is a group that is directing itself towards something that is bad. And you can't have shared principles. By the way, this presupposes good principles, if it is to be a principle at all. You cannot have that concord if the group itself is not worthy of it by being directed towards the good. So this doesn't always happen from day one. From day one, there can be plenty of giddiness holding the group together, thinking that everything's great. But over time, sooner or later, discord enters in and tears the group apart. It does not have the approach of friendship. All right. Next interesting point on benefactors. This is part 7 of this book. Benefactors, he says, seem to love those whom they benefit more than those who have received benefits love those who have conferred them. And it is asked why this is so, and it seems unreasonable. Aristotle has a very fascinating answer to this question. In fact, I think his answer to this question deserves a doctoral dissertation. So I'm not going to do it justice in a minute here, but I'm going to try and at least make some sense of what he says. First of all, what does he mean? A benefactor is one who benefits another. It is a greater thing than a mere creditor. He acknowledges that the cynical explanation for this is that, benefactors love those they benefit simply because let me ask you this. Why does your bank love you? Why does the bank you took out a loan from love you? Interest. Yeah, interest, so they can get the money back. They don't love you, unfortunately. I shouldn't say that, because maybe they do, but they probably don't. That's the cynical explanation. Benefactors love those whom they benefit even more than the ones receiving the benefit love the benefactors, because the benefactors want to make sure they get something back. But Aristotle says that's not why. The real reason lies deeper. That's a reductionistic answer. That's very common in the modern realm of philosophy, where the greatest things are always attempted to be explained away with reductionistic explanations that we all know miss the mark completely. Aristotle says something that he cannot possibly prove here, but it's still worth mentioning. He's not a rationalist. He doesn't restrict himself only to those simple dictates of reason alone. He says every artist loves his own handiwork more than that handiwork, if it were to come to life, would love him. It's not something that ever has happened, ever will happen, But I think he's right. If it were to happen, yeah, the artist would love his own handiwork even more than the handiwork would love the artist, because there's something about being a benefactor. And what is that something? Well, Aristotle says that a benefactor is one who activates his own existence in the best and most powerful possible way. And since existence is our first and greatest good, the greater a good is, the more it can be loved. So the greatest good is that which can be loved the most. But since existence is our greatest good, we will always love most that which is best for our very existence. And Aristotle has repeatedly said we exist actively. The good life is the active life, the life of active virtue. One who benefits another, one who blesses another, in other words, one who helps another, is actually, yes, he's helping the other person, but Aristotle says in truth, such a benefactor is activating his own existence in the best possible way by benefiting and helping someone else. And by activating your own existence, you are loving your greatest good. And the greatest good, again, is that which can also be loved most. I find this fascinating. The reason of this is that all things desire and love existence. But we exist in activity, since we exist by living and doing. And in a sense, one who has made something exists actively. And so he loves his handiwork because he loves existence. This, in fact, is a fundamental principle of nature. He follows this up by saying, what is profitable is not so pleasant or lovable as what is noble. You will love, which also means enjoy. That's part of it. You will love doing what is noble more than you will love doing what is merely profitable. Something profitable meaning something that is more superficially in accordance with some benefit of pleasure or utility. Reading a book on business marketing is more profitable than reading Lord of the Rings, to continue with the same example. You will enjoy reading Lord of the Rings more. Why? Because it's more noble. It is better. So, although benefiting another doesn't, superficially speaking, help you as much as receiving benefits does, it is better and more noble, and therefore also more enjoyable, and it activates your own existence in the best possible way. Therefore, you love it the most. I think he's really onto something here. That he only puts a couple paragraphs into it, but again, I think this is worth a whole dissertation. But I don't know of anybody having ever done that. Maybe I'll have to. So the most obvious case of a benefactor. Well, for the vast majority of us, I know there's exceptions, but for the vast majority of us, our greatest benefactors are who? Our parents. And yeah, we all kind of know that's kind of a general fact of human nature, is that parents have even more love for their children than children do for their parents. And yes, children tend to love their parents, hopefully. That's a good thing. But just generally, there's no denying that there's generally even more love from the parent to the child as vice versa. Why? Well, there is much more, the parent is much more the benefactor of the child than vice versa. There is more work, more benefit in the other. It is, as any parent will readily attest, enormous sacrifice. And I can certainly attest to that personally, having 3 children myself. So Aristotle also had children, so I'm sure he's drawing from his own experience here. This whole book is named after his son. Anyway, what can I put down for your notes for that? Let's see. I don't have anything good in my notes here, so I don't know how I'm going to put this succinctly and clearly. It will not be both, that's for sure. And since I'm going to have to make it succinct for the sake of time, it probably won't be clear. One who actively benefits another. Actually, let me change that. One who just benefits. Let's keep it simple. One who benefits another. In so doing, activates his own existence. since existence is our first and greatest good, as Aristotle himself says. Aristotle is often slandered as an anti-existentialist, as an essentialist, in other words. But in fact, he said the very opposite. Aristotle's own words proclaim that existence is our first and greatest good. I don't know if this makes any sense, but hopefully it'll at least recall in your mind when you read it in your notes this discussion. So our first and greatest good is can be most loved. So sure, when you benefit another, you're expending blood, sweat, and tears, you're spending money and time, but all of those things are superfluous, secondary to our existence. So you're losing very small things, but you are gaining an infinitely greater thing, namely the activation of your own existence, which is your greatest good. All the other things we do to superficially benefit ourselves don't really activate our own existence very well, but benefiting others does. And that's why the benefactor loves the most. And we can and should and must all be benefactors in our own way to others. How about being a lover of self? His next question. Aristotle says we censure, meaning criticize, those who put themselves first. And lover of self is used as a term of reproach. In other words, we criticize people who are lovers of self. If you call someone a lover of self, that's just as true today, 2,500 years later, as it was in Aristotle's day, that you probably mean that as a criticism. If you might say, yeah, he loves himself all right. There's not much praise hidden in that. But doesn't that seem kind of strange that that is a criticism also? Because we probably should love ourselves, right? Should we hate ourselves? Should we loathe ourselves? Of course not. We should love ourselves. So this is something that needs to be pondered more deeply. And Aristotle does precisely that. He says, first of all, man is his own best friend, or should be. Therefore, he ought to love himself most. But when the term lover of self is used as a reproach, this has arisen from the fact that self-love of the ordinary kind is bad. Hence, self-love is rightly censured in those who are lovers of themselves in that sense. But it is also true that the virtues, I'm skipping ahead here and I'll tie it together in a moment. Hence, the good man will be a lover of self in the fullest degree, though in another sense than the lover of self so-called by way of reproach, from whom he differs, as much as living by principle differs from living by passion. The lover of self in the proper sense of the word. To love something the most is to want what is best for that something. But to want what is best for oneself is to want the greatest goods for oneself. And to live in accordance with desiring the greatest goods for oneself requires living in accordance, as Aristotle says, with a principle, because our passions don't draw us towards that. No, I don't know of anyone whose base desires just are always drawing them towards virtue and nobility and all this good stuff. Instead, it is a deliberate choice to live by a principle. This is self-love in the proper sense. Living that type of a life does not take any good from anybody else. In fact, it is giving away, as we said in the last discussion, as in the last question, it is giving away those goods that actually claims the greatest goods for oneself. So someone who is selfless is someone who will give up his seat so that someone else doesn't have to stand. It's someone who will give up his place in the line so that someone else gets the better food at the buffet. It's someone who will give up his seat in the lifeboat when the Titanic's going down, because even life itself is below goodness itself. Such a person might seem to hate his own life almost. He's taking all these goods and just throwing them out of his life and giving them to others. But in fact, he loves himself the most, because in doing those acts, he's reserving for himself the greatest goods, moral nobility. Let's see how Aristotle puts it. It is also true that the virtuous man's conduct is often guided by the interests of his friends and of his country, and that he will, if necessary, lay down his life in their behalf. For he will surrender wealth and power and all good things men struggle to win if he can secure nobility for himself. Since he would prefer an hour of rapture to a long period of mild enjoyment, a year of noble life to many years of ordinary existence, one great and glorious exploit to many small successes. And I think there's Socrates, who no doubt had others telling him, or even if not that, at least a little voice in his head saying, but if only you escape from prison, if only you lie, and if only you promise stop philosophizing, even you can still do so much more good things in the several years you have left in your life. No, the really good man will prefer one great and glorious exploit to many small successes, as Aristotle says. Aristotle continues, and this is doubtless the case with those who give their lives for others. Thus they choose great nobility for themselves. Also the virtuous man is ready to forego money, if by that means his friends may gain more money. For thus, though his friend gets money, he himself achieves nobility, and so he assigns the greater good to his own share. And he behaves in the same manner as regards honors and offices also. All these things he will relinquish to his friend. So this is not competitive. These greatest goods, you don't have to compete over them with other people. If there's a given amount of money in a pot somewhere, you got to compete with everybody else in the room for those dollars. But you don't over virtue and goodness. Why? You could give something away, and then you could say, oh, but if I give something to somebody else, I've stolen the moral nobility from him. Well, no, you haven't, because he can also give it away. There's a little saying that's become popular recently. It's a little too cute for my liking, but it has a good point. Pay it forward, yeah. Pay it forward, that's what Aristotle is saying. Because when you do that, you are not, first of all, nothing's lost, even superficially. Somebody else has the money, and maybe they'll use it even better than you will have. But also they too can do the same thing you just did. And each time that's done, this goodness, which is infinite, which is never exhaustible, just keeps building up and building up and building up. And the world keeps becoming a better and a better and a better place. And we can do that constantly. And the good man is doing that constantly. It's part of what makes him a good man, good person. Okay. I'm going to lose my voice soon, I think. But self-love of the ordinary sort is wrong, he says. Next point. Wait, did I give you guys anything for that? Sorry. let me give you something for that. Okay, the wrong way. I'm going to put this really short. Wanting / pursuing the lower goods. For oneself at the expense of others having them. One who always needs the most comfortable seat, the most tasty looking food at the buffet, who never wants to get off his butt and do something for other people because he wants that comfort. One who's always pursuing the lower goods for oneself at the expense of others having them. The right way. Seeking the higher goods for oneself. And again, this is not miserable and joyless. You go to bed happier than anyone, no matter how. One who lives that way always goes to bed much happier than those even who have successfully acquired all sorts of good things for themselves, in the superficial sense of the word, the monies, the comforts, the pleasures. There's a quote, and I can't remember who it's from. Virtue proves the roughest path, but gives at night a bed of down, a comfortable sleep, in other words, which is not intended literally. A bed of down is analogous for a happy conscience and a demeanor that is always at peace. This is deeply related to one of Socrates' main doctrines, that it is better to suffer than to commit an injustice. He says next, it would be strange to represent the supremely happy man as a recluse. Socrates just spent a lot of time talking about how the good person enjoys his own company. He loves being by himself. He's thinking about good things. Aristotle puts it, he has subjects stored up in his mind for contemplation. If that sounds abstract, don't let it sound too abstract. He's got great, glorious, good, true, and beautiful things to think about. When he has time to sit there and think, he's not agonizing over things. He's not being all depressed. He's not being all anxious. He's not fretting about his to-do list. He's not fretting about finances and what he has and his to-do and his obligations. He's instead contemplating the good. He is loving the good intellectually. But it would be strange, nevertheless, for the happy man, the supremely happy man, to be a recluse. In other words, a hermit. Nobody would choose to have all possible good things in the condition that he must enjoy them alone. That's very similar to what he said in the beginning of Book 8. No one would choose to live without friends but possessing all other good things. You would have, if you had, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. There are two news stories about, I don't like blaming celebrities for everything because philosophical teachings are for our own betterment, not for just talking about how bad celebrities are, but still, they do give good examples. I was recently in the news that Jeff Bezos, is that how you say his name, or is it Bezos? I don't know. He apparently just bought a $400 million yacht, which is like you can't even imagine that much money, but also his wife recently left him. Talk about a juxtaposition of two major events. He's got this $400 million yacht, and he probably has no one to enjoy it with. He probably hates it already. He probably hates it after owning it for a couple days, and he probably can't stand being near it. Meanwhile, if you live the good life, you can rest your head in your pillow at night being genuinely happy, such that Jeff Bezos would truly envy you, and you would have nothing to envy him for at all. Okay. But a man is a social being, Aristotle says yet again, designed by nature to live with others. Accordingly, the happy man must have society, for he has everything that is naturally good. It is obviously preferable to associate with friends and good men rather than strangers and chance companions. Therefore, the happy man will require friends. So yeah, even though the person living the good life is happy and loves his own company, he also has good friends and loves their company. And that's a very important part of his life. As we said at the beginning, happiness is a form of activity. And an activity clearly is something that comes into being, not a thing that we possess all the time like a piece of property. But if happiness consists in life and activity, and the activity of a good man, as we said at the beginning, is good and so pleasant in itself, and if the sense of the thing as our own is also pleasant, yet we are better able to contemplate our neighbors than ourselves, and their actions than our own. And thus good men find pleasure in the actions of other good men who are their friends, since those actions possess both these essentially pleasant qualities. And it therefore follows that the supremely happy man will require good friends. How does friendship relate to happiness, therefore? Well, let me expound on what Aristotle says here, but let me put something down on the board before I forget to. Happiness consists in a good life. But the goodness, okay, so we're always being directed at the goodness, the good life, but when you're actually contemplating the good, how specifically do you go about doing that? How specifically do you go about loving and appreciating the good? Do you just spend time thinking about how good you are and all the good things you do? No, that's sick. That's called what? Narcissism of some sort. Pride. You should do good things, yes, but you shouldn't spend a bunch of time patting yourself in the back for it. That's creepy. You should instead love and appreciate the good of others. And that is one of the key reasons why even the supremely good and happy man will require good friends. The goodness of others, especially of friends, is better contemplated than one's own goodness. So you should be absorbed in the goodness of others when you're contemplating good, not your own good. So yes, the supremely happy man needs good friends. But how many? Well, before we get to that, Aristotle has a couple pages here that I'm going to kind of not really go through, except to point out one quick thing he says. He says, for a good man, in virtue of his goodness, he enjoys actions that conform with virtue, and dislikes those that spring from wickedness. Just as a skilled musician is pleased by good music and pained by bad. This is such an important point, and it gets to what he was saying earlier about virtue being something that is enjoyed by the virtuous. It's not necessarily, the key thing to emphasize is that that's not necessarily true at first, when one first embarks upon the path of goodness. But we must do so nevertheless, trusting that in time we will enjoy what is good. We cannot be enslaved to whatever desires we happen to find foisted upon our psyches when we wake up in the morning. That's just living a life in accordance with chance, not principle. That's just letting random biochemical facts determine who you are, which is not a very good way to live. What you feel inclined towards might be some random distillation of what you ate last and who you happen to hang out with last week and like what was in the news and all this other random stuff. And we can't just say, oh, that's who I am, that's just my preference, that's just what I like. You are who you choose to be, Aristotle's saying. You are who you choose to be, and that's all there is to it. Over time, if you make good choices repeatedly for long enough, you'll start to enjoy the very things that those good choices are oriented towards. It won't happen at first, but it might happen sooner than you think. I can attest to this from my own experience. I loved horrendous music in high school. Terrible. Garbage. And I finally, one day, I just kind of intellectually realized that I loved garbage. And I had made it, so my intellect discovered this, and then my will made a decision. It decided to stop listening to the garbage and to turn on music that was objectively good, and only that. And enough time passed of those decisions, and now it literally pains me to hear the music that I loved in high school. It's like nauseating to me now, and it is nauseating stuff. But if I just had always decided, you know what, I'm going to just be enslaved to whatever desires that my friends and my biology and my society happen to foist upon me, then I never would have gotten to this place. And I'm so glad I did change, because it is so much more conducive to one's peace and joy and happiness to appreciate what is good. And I'm just talking superficially now in terms of art, but more importantly in terms of virtue, how we should make these decisions. But it's still worth considering. Not that I'm a fan of having to decide everything in accordance with what studies tell us, but it's worth noting that studies have shown that music, and I used to always encourage my SAT students to do this. I did a lot of SAT tutoring, and I said, at least for a couple days before the SAT, at least the day of, at least the morning of, turn off your hard rock and your rap and whatever else, and turn on Bach and Mozart. Studies have shown that this music actually measurably increases your mathematical reasoning skills and your critical thinking skills in general. This keeps getting shown in studies. And it's no accident. That music is objectively beautiful. It is saturated with order, harmony, mathematics. That forms you. What you expose yourself to repeatedly over time, it is always forming you. This is especially true with the young, especially true with children, but it's true with everybody. We're always being formed with what we choose to expose ourselves to. So Aristotle would implore us to make those choices wisely, no matter how we might feel inclined at first. Okay, final point. Why not acquire as many friends as possible? With all of this talk on how glorious friendship is and how much we need it and how even the supremely happy man will need friends, it naturally would seem to follow that you should hop on Facebook now and friend everybody you can find. But no, Aristotle says stop, don't friend everybody you can find. Why? First of all, friendships based on pleasure and utility, it's not even practically possible to have that many. But even friendships based on the goodness, Aristotle says we shouldn't have as many as possible. We shouldn't have tons of friendships based on the goodness. Because a genuine friend, let me read his quote, shares in the joys and the what? The sorrows. A genuine friend is not there only in the sunny times. A genuine friend shares equally in your joys and your sorrows. And you can't be there for the joys and the sorrows of many people. It's not practically possible. Genuine friendship, therefore, we can have down. Friendship based on the good. You know, friendships based on pleasure and utility, they're always finding excuses to not be there in the hard times. But a genuine friendship based on the good entails sharing in the joys and the sorrows of the friend. I think that most of us, when we realize that a friendship wasn't genuine, or at least that the other friend wasn't genuine, we realize that when that person's not there in the hard times, but only there in the easy, fun times. They're always there for the party and never there for when you need them. So we can't do that for tons of people. How many? Aristotle's not going to give you a number. He's just going to say it's however many you can regularly associate with. He says constantly. I think he means regularly. And and this is particularly true. He says in love. He means now romantic love. Love means friendship in the superlative degree, the highest degree. And that, he says, must be with one person only. And that is an extreme example of how even friendships based on the good, there should not be lots of them. So there's Nicomachean ethics. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to be really nice to you guys. To have our final Aristotelian discussion would take more time than I want to make you guys stay for tonight. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to basically just give you the answers. I know technically I could keep everyone till 9:50, but I always promised I'd let you guys out early since we only take one break, so I'll stick to that. And I will make sure we're out and not long here. And I will do that by, instead of having a full-blown discussion on Aristotelian metaphysics and logic, I am going to do what I almost never do here. I'm going to put the answers on the Elmo, because this will be important to have down for the final, just how I set up the final in previous semesters. There's a good number of questions on it from this sheet, so I really want to make sure you have it. So I'll give it to you right now. And I will quickly discuss this as you guys jot down for your own notes what I put here on the projector. But it will be a rather inadequate discussion because I'm just going to race through this stuff. Usually works if I press the on button. There we go. Okay, there's all the answers. If you guys have those down, you will be completely fine for this part on the final exam. Okay, so let me just talk about this a bit as you guys jot that down. This will be the fastest crash course in history on Aristotelian metaphysics and logic. One of the most confusing and complex and large realms of philosophy. Okay, metaphysics and logic, first of all, are quite distinct. I'm lumping them together into one discussion sheet just because I felt like it, but they are definitely distinct studies. Metaphysics being that which is beyond physics, meta simply meaning beyond, physics simply meaning nature. So beyond nature, by which, as I mentioned previously, he does not mean supernatural, but simply that he is considering questions that pierce beyond the empirical data. Questions that you could not possibly answer by looking at what a microscope shows, even though Aristotle is a big fan of being informed by the microscopes and what have you. I don't mean that literally, there were no microscopes in his day, but I mean simply empirically. All right. His most important teaching in metaphysics is probably his four causes, which I brought up briefly in class 1, in lecture 1. Material, formal, efficient, and final. Basically, the four ways of explaining the what, why, how of a thing. We can describe its material cause, which is simply saying that out of which it came to be. The matter of a thing is mere potency. It is not actuality, which I'll get to in a moment. A thing only comes into being by virtue of its form, or in other words, its formal cause, being imposed upon a given material substrate. And only when we have a composite of matter and form do we have a specific being. But the essence of that being is with respect to what? Its form, its formal cause. You remember that, no doubt, from the discussion on the forms. Formal cause is simply what it is. It is its essence, the essence of the thing in question. But by merely describing the material and the formal causes, we've only talked about that which is intrinsic to the thing in question. There are also important extrinsic questions pertaining to the efficient and the final causes, the third and the fourth of the four causes. Efficient cause, by what or by whom it came to be. What brought this thing into existence? Nothing happens spontaneously. There's an explanation for everything that happens. Anything coming into being, we must explain what brought that thing into being. Even more importantly, its final cause. Why was it brought into being? In other words, why did the efficient cause go about imposing the formal cause upon the material cause? That is the relation between those four causes. The efficient cause imposes the formal cause upon the material cause for the sake of the final cause. If this is confusing, don't worry. I'm not testing you guys in comprehending all this fully. I'm not pretending I do either. I don't know how many people out there have Aristotelian metaphysics completely mastered. But if you just have this down, you'll be fine for the final. So that's all you have to worry about. What is meant by the distinction between substance and accident? Well, Aristotle says that first of all, it is the oversimplification of all history to say that there's simply material, concrete particulars, and then there's forms. You know, that's kind of, we talked about that being a way that Plato divides things up. But there's all sorts of different categories of being. Aristotle has his famous 10 categories, which I don't give you on this sheet, but one of them is substance. The other of the 10 categories, the other 9, are accidents. Substance is primary existence. It is a thing itself. It is something that exists in its own right. It is not said of other things. Accidents, on the other hand, are realities of some sort. There are 9 categories of accidents that are said of a substance. They are ways we describe a substance. They are qualities of some sort that substances can possess. They cannot exist by themselves. Forms tend to be accidents. 3 does not exist anywhere. A cat exists, and there can be 3 cats. A cat can have 3 toes. Which is probably not ideal, but that can happen. So, you are a substance. Gold is a substance. Water is a substance. We say things of substances. How do we know if something is a substance? Well, that's quite a discussion. But if it can be divided without losing its identity, that's one hint. But let's talk about act and potency. Act is what is in actuality. It is what we can actually say of a thing at a given time. It is often described as work, that which is happening, that which is in the moment. I have an example there of a tree and a seed, distinguishing act and potency. Potency is what can be. As beings with reason, for example, we all have the potency to know multivariable calculus. We do not all have that knowledge in act, but we have the potency for it. You have the potency for language. A dog does not. The value of a thing derives from its potency. Why? Because the mere accident of time is often what distinguishes act from potency. Time, Aristotle says, and this is not in your sheet, is the measure of the reduction of potency to act. The reduction of potency to act is called motion. Motion, generally speaking, is just something that can be becoming something that is. When we measure that process, we call measuring it time. In other words, time is not a substance, Aristotle says. Simply recognizing basic Aristotelian teachings on time helps resolve so many supposed dilemmas in sci-fi and in philosophical discussions where no one bothers to bring up Aristotle. Simply recognizing that time is not a substance. It's not a thing that you can mess with like gold or water. Rather, it is a simple measure. It is a measure of motion. If you don't have motion to measure, you don't have time. If your car battery dies, you might still have all your radio presets, you might still have some other things stored in the computer, but what will you not have? Yeah, when you get a new battery put in, it won't have the correct time. Because you needed a constant flow of energy to give you some sort of emotion, which in turn can be measured to give you time. If your computer has no access to the internet and it runs out of battery, it will not know the time when you turn it back on. There's no way of knowing. It had nothing to measure. Aristotle is spot on, I think. Anyway, I won't go through this again because we talked about this enough in the first class. But just remember, what we didn't talk about in the first class was the middle term. You'll definitely want to have down that the middle term is present in both premises, but absent in the conclusion. It is, we talked, I think, enough about the syllogism in the first class, so I don't think I'll go over that again. And there's a valid and invalid. You can have any valid or fallacious syllogism down that you want, and that'll suffice. And that's it. So I did that even more quickly than I thought I would. Wow. So that's all I've got for you today. There's a whole degree's worth of Aristotelian metaphysics in like 10 minutes.